Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. Happy Wednesday. I hope that you all have been doing well and staying safe and making smart decisions and all of that. Today, we are rounding out the week by concluding our discussions about Jung and psychoanalysis and the nature of the self, the nature of personal identity. So I've already told you kind of a little bit about Jung, his background, all that kind of stuff. I'm just going to do a little bit of a recap on what we talked about in the last lecture to kind of ground this lecture a little bit and to understand what Jung has going on in the second half of this essay. If you haven't done so already, please look at the lecture notes that I'm going to upload with this lecture that I have pulled up right here, and go ahead and click on this link and listen to the music before you listen to this lecture. Then kind of try to think to yourself what the music has to do with the lecture that I'm talking about today, or the part of the reading that I'm talking about. Okay, so just to review, some of the stuff that we learned in the last lecture were some of Carl Jung's key concepts. So we talked about this concept of the collective unconscious. This is a hypothesis that Jung has that not only does the unconscious part of our mind, not only is it influenced by our own lived experience and our own personal lives, but it's also influenced by the stories, cultures, and ways of lives of our ancestors. So the collective unconscious, according to Jung, is the aspects of our unconscious mind that we've inherited from our our parents and our ancestors before them. And the way these show up in the mind are dispositions to experience certain images and thoughts, uh, or to view things in a certain way, see the world in a certain way. What Jung calls the archetypes are these universal predispositions to experience certain mental images or themes. And the archetypes are basically present in all of humanity in varying degrees, given that we all come from uh, the same line or the same family of humans if we trace back our ancestral history far enough. Archetypes, those predispositions, are different than the images that they uh, bring up in our minds. Archetypal images are the names for those images or themes themselves that cultures universally experience or represent in their stories and mythologies and stuff. So the archetypal images, according to Jung, are the universal symbols and associations that we find in various cultures, religions, mythologies, and fairy tales. We find them in every culture. Um, and images that I'm thinking about and that Jung is talking about here are things like light, representing like hope and goodness, darkness representing despair or evil. Uh, all cultures have this concept of the wilderness representing danger and chaos. These are the images that we are kind of predisposed to experience and think about, and that structure the way our minds operate on account of uh, those aspects of the mind that we've inherited from our ancestors. Finally, we talked about the shadow, and each person has their own individual shadow, which is the set of each person's repressed and oftentimes unknown aspects of their personality. So this can be traumatic experiences that we've had in the past, repressed thoughts and feelings and desires that we kind of push away below the surface that we don't want to deal with. Each one of us, according to Jung, has a shadow that is made up of all those unconscious elements that we kind of push away and that we don't want to look at. So today we're going to be continuing to talk about these themes, these concepts, these ideas, and we're going to talk about what Jung has to say about the human mind in modern society, in a contemporary context. So he starts off this half of the reading by continuing to talk about dreams and symbolism and the archetypes more generally. And he's come to this conclusion that the modern human mind is kind of sick or broken in a way. Um, we have not been paying enough attention to what's been going on in our unconscious minds, and we have failed to kind of confront that, and that's caused a lot of strife. But we'll see that here in a second. Continuing on with his idea, with Jung's idea of the archetypes and the collective unconscious, Jung emphasizes, and this is one of the main points of this lecture and the lecture before this on Monday, that both the human body and the human mind are products of evolutionary, cultural, historical processes. And I'm going to read a quote here that is on page 67 that sums this up quite nicely. He says, just as the human body represents a whole museum of organs, each with a long evolutionary history behind it, so we should expect to find that the mind is organized in a similar way. This immensely old psyche forms the basis of our mind just as much as the structure of our body is based on the general anatomical pattern of the mammal. So what Jung is getting at here is not only has the way our body uh, not only has the growth and development of our body been influenced by various genetic mutations in our evolutionary history, but also our mind has been influenced by uh, the characteristics that and experiences that our ancestors have passed down to us through their DNA. And this is kind of a hint as to what the song is about in this lecture, if you've listened to that. What Jung is saying here is that the way our ancestors lived and experienced the world, those have been cemented uh, in archetypal forms, and these forms dynamically alter consciousness and the way we see ourselves and the world. These archetypal forms, these predispositions to experience certain themes and images, they don't just sit there doing nothing in the mind. They actually play an active role on how the mind organizes itself and how the mind processes information that it gets from the surrounding environment. In other words, how we see and understand the world is influenced both by the way society currently is and operates and the way society used to be. We are reflections not only of current social structures and systems, but we are also reflections of past social structures and systems, insofar as the way that society is currently structured is based on the way, at least minutely, that it was structured in the past. So the way this is connected with dreams and symbolism in the unconscious mind is, in order to understand our dreams, in order to understand the symbols our dreams hold, and in order to understand our own minds better, we really need to trace the history of our culture's mythology and the way our culture has historically understood the world to be. And by mythology here, I don't mean made up stories and fairy tales and folk tales. What I mean when I say mythology is the story that our society has come up with for understanding why and how things are the way they are. So currently, our culture's mythology is influenced heavily by sciences, by the STEM fields. So our current mythology is that science can explain everything, and we only need to do natural science to understand why things are the way they are and what stuff is made of, basically. That's kind of our current culture's mythology. However, what this mythology is getting us to see now is that on account of our privileging of science and logic and reason and evidence-based methodologies for acquiring knowledge, basically on account of the Enlightenment, um, this privileging of consciousness and logic and reason over all other things like emotions, religion, art, mythology in general, uh, these are having a lasting and an important negative influence on us. One of the big things that Jung is getting at in the second half of the reading is that humans' intense prioritization of this stuff, of science, consciousness, and logic and reason, over emotion, religion, art, and the social sciences, has really caused us to become alienated from our past and the cultural traditions and way of life that give rise to the way of life that we participate in now. Um, for example, uh, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment uh, really has caused us to look down on Christianity, for example. And it's caused us to look down on uh, the spiritual ways of life that we used to engage in and that we used to take for granted in the way we understood the world and what the appropriate reactions to suffering and pain were. Now what we're seeing, according to Jung, is that this scientific kind of rationalist way that we've been viewing the world for the last few hundred years has caused us to uh, become much more easily susceptible to nihilistic ways of viewing the world and have made it much more difficult for us to face problems and suffering. On account of the fact that, for example, Christianity and religion lately has kind of been pushed to the side and rendered useless or rendered false by contemporary science, many people have been left without meaning in their lives, and they've fallen into nihilism and hopelessness. A lot of people think nowadays, on account of the scientific revolution, that life is meaningless, that there's no purpose to life, that there is no such thing as objective morality or objective ethical standards. This is exactly kind of what Nietzsche warned us about in his philosophy. Uh, and we'll be talking about Nietzsche later in this class, but I'll just bring him up now because Jung was highly influenced by Nietzsche. Nietzsche said that once a society has kind of uh, destabilized its foundations, and more specifically its religious foundations that have given people structure to their lives and meaning to their lives, once that stuff's been thrown out of the window, like contemporary society has done mainly, um, people are going to turn to nihilism and start thinking that nothing really matters at all. That once we're given an objective standard of truth and meaning and purpose, if that rug is ripped out from under us, people are start going to having a hard time with stuff and start thinking that their lives don't matter, and they're not going to be able to draw on the same tools that our ancestors drew on to make sense of why suffering occurs in the world and what we can do in the face of that suffering and how to persevere in the face of that suffering. In short, what Jung is getting at here in the second half of this essay is that the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and our prevailing scientific systems are really of no help in uh, resisting the kind of existential dread that we're facing now as inhabitants in this world. Uh, Scientific systems like physics and chemistry and biology, they have rid us of the tools that past cultures and societies have used to establish that psychic equilibrium that we were talking about in the last lecture. These scientific systems have rid us of the symbols and the stories and the religions and the mythologies that our ancestors have used in the past to kind of overcome the sufferings that they faced and make sense of their significance in the face of an infinite universe. Really, what these scientific systems have done, though they've been very helpful in a lot of regards insofar as our technology has advanced and stuff like that, they've made it very difficult for us to integrate our conscious and our unconscious minds. And so Jung sees kind of the modern mind as kind of having regressed in a few ways. We've progressed in some ways, but we've also regressed in a lot of psychological ways too. In short, what Jung is saying here is that modern humans find themselves in an incredibly complex world, divorced from their humble mythological beginnings, and they're really unable to fully understand themselves or the world around them, partly because they have forsaked their their cultures and their ancestors' mythological and religious traditions. Jung kind of rounds out this part of the essay by saying that, in order to reach personal fulfillment and lead happy lives and to treat others ethically, what we need to do is we need to critically reflect on our own culture's mythology and history and its origins. We need to try to reconcile the different directions that we're being pulled in as members of society that place certain expectations on us, conflicting expectations. And we need to try to reconcile the conflicting beliefs and desires that we have, both as individuals that want to do our own things, as well as members of society that kind of need to work together to make everything go hunky-dory. In short, we really need to seek to understand our own minds and bodies and listen to what they are telling us. Each one of us must do this ourselves personally. We really need to try to understand ourselves to the core and try to understand what repressed experiences and desires we're harboring in our unconscious minds. Because successful social change starts with an individual change, with looking critically deep within at one's own biases and one's own unconscious desires and repressed experiences and ways of looking at the world. Only by understanding ourselves can we begin to understand other people and treat them ethically. I think maybe a good example of this might be what's going on right now in politics and the current political climate that we have. What with all the protests and stuff going on, and the movement that we're seeing, and the work in the program that people in the Black Lives Matter movement are doing. What I'm seeing a lot politically is a lot of condemnation at what the protesters and rioters are doing with respect to, property destruction and the looting and the burning and the pillaging and stuff like that. But I think what Jung would say, and what I would urge you all to do, is not just morally condemn that stuff. That doesn't really get us anywhere. What we need to do is we need to have a conversation about why we think that stuff is happening in the first place. Even if you think these protesters are wrong and systemic racism doesn't really exist in the United States, you should really try to take their cause seriously and listen to them. There is a reason why these protests and these lootings and pillagings are occurring, right? There is a reason why people are now standing up and protesting against what they see as oppressive, hurtful systems of economics and society, right? And so, if we really want to understand what's going on politically, we really need to take a look at the cultural history and the history of the United States more generally. What I'm hearing is that in order to really understand what's going on and why these protests are occurring, we need to look at the history of slavery in the United States. We need to look at the history of, discrimination and the passing of discriminatory pieces of legislation and policy. We need to look at the way different social groups have been treated in this society. And really what all that is it's a critical reflection on our culture's social ways of life and traditions, right? In order to understand why it is that these protests and these pushbacks and forms of resistance are occurring now, we need to understand from what historical contexts and historical ways of life and patterns of oppression have given rise to these things. It's not just enough to say, I don't like what they're doing and we shouldn't really think about it, we should just condemn it. That is not that is not really taking a charitable, ethical stance towards this stuff. What we really need to be focusing on now as a society is trying to understand why this stuff is occurring now, uh, what it is that protesters are feeling, and we need to try to understand, for example, what it is that they're resisting specifically. Um, Simply saying that the stuff that a lot of protesters and rioters are doing is bad isn't really adding anything to the conversation. And I think Jung would agree here a little bit. In order to begin to fix the social problems that we have in this country and our own personal problems, whether that be, lack of self-esteem or confidence or traumatic experiences that we faced in the past, we need to confront our own cultures, history, and we need to confront the kinds of ways of life that preceded us and the ways of life that we are engaging in now, and the social and economic systems that we are either voluntarily or complicitly providing support for. So that's just an example, I think, of how Jung's philosophy can kind of be applied to what's going on right now in contemporary politics and society. So if there's anything to get out of these first two lectures about what Jung has to say about the nature of the self and the unconscious mind, is that we are definitely shaped by the way society currently operates and by the way society operated in the past. In order to fully understand uh, how we see the world that we do and how we act within the world, we really need to understand ourselves and our own cultural and uh, social history. I think that's probably a pretty good summary of what Jung has going on here. So, as we move forward, as we prepare for investigating what ethics is, what makes an action moral or immoral, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. What kinds of cultural systems have influenced the values that we hold nowadays? Do we want to continue holding on to the same values that we do? Are there uh, historical problems that we really have not dealt with as a society? And have those historical problems scarred us, uh, minorities, other people? These are things that we should be thinking about when we're concerned with leading ethical lives now and in the future. In any case, I'll leave it there. Uh, you know, think about this stuff, reflect on it, have conversations with your friends and family about it, and yeah, just think about what you can do as an individual to start thinking about what's holding you back personally from thinking about ethical issues, and just what's holding you back personally in your own life. I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and I will see you in the next lecture. Okay, have a great day.